I hope, Stephen, I've done a good enough job of introducing the report. And I will now request the panelists in no particular order. Maybe Peter, would you like to start? So you can talk about the digital divide from your perspective, whatever you want, and then give examples from Canada.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Rajat. So Canada, second largest landmass, geographically, topographically, our population is concentrated around the 49th parallel on the border to the U.S., but some of our challenges with respect to digital access stem from the geography and getting it into rural areas and First Nations. Before I get into the specifics of policies affecting technology and innovation, I just want to back up a little bit and talk about the general economic environment, because I think it does play into the business friendliness or unfriendliness of Canada right now, especially as compared to our southern neighbors. And how it's impacting the technology sector. So there's definitely a sense from the FANG companies that Canada's a little bit hostile to bigness. It's a bit of a fad these days to do so, and we've seen the introduction of a few taxes following that, the Online Streaming Act and the Digital Services Tax. Canada kind of went out alone there and imposing that, and so other countries didn't follow, and we may see some retaliation in the upcoming trade negotiations between Canada and the U.S. as a result. And we have a lack of competition in the telecom and broadband sectors, which I'll get into further. But some of the general economic situation in Canada, just to paint the picture for you. Our productivity has declined considerably in the past decade. It's 10% lower now than the U.S. It had been tracking right alongside the U.S. for since the 70s, but now a sharp gap has opened up. So that's very concerning. Some factors that may explain it: a 40% increase in the size of government since 2015 after a regime change. There have been, many grants and subsidies going out. So this type of approach to pleasing business rather than the removal of barriers approach. We have a high tax burden, both corporately and personal income tax, again, compared to, many of our competitor American states. And so I think that just goes to show, and we hear this from tech companies, that Canada just needs to align more with other markets that investors may rather go to. Another final general issue is R&D spending, and thanks to ITIF for pointing this out. In 2023, Canada's business R&D spending in advanced sectors is just 22% of the size adjusted global average and 11% of the size adjusted U.S. level. So it's far behind those of technologically advanced countries. So I spoke a little bit about the Digital Services Tax and Online Streaming Act. With respect to artificial intelligence, Canada was influenced by the EU's policy in developing the IDA framework that's currently before the government, and I would characterize it as overbroad. It doesn't take a targeted approach, and I think artificial intelligence, it's the emerging dynamic technology right now. So we may be missing out on the innovation there if we take too early and restrictive a regulatory approach. With respect to broadband access, digital access, especially First Nations, is a challenge. The Canadian Shield, covers much of Canada, and it's basically rock. So it proves challenging for the creation of the proper infrastructure there. Fiber is really ideal for speed, but it's expensive, and fixed wireless offers a cheaper but less effective alternative here. And interestingly, Rajat was referring to it earlier, that a certain concentration in the infrastructure space for broadband, that we see that everywhere, but then there's spin-off effects. And in Canada, we only have a few broadband providers, and we have third-party access, which basically requires them to then lease it out to ISPs. And it's not, I wouldn't say definitive, but there is a sense that policy is in fact, making it less attractive for these broadband companies to expand into the rural areas, because it's already not that profitable from an economic perspective. So maybe a rethink on how we do third-party access is warranted. And then the telecom sector, also not as competitive as other countries, higher costs and lower quality for consumers. We only have a few big players. We would argue that we need to focus on creating incentives for private investment. And in this space, we actually restrict foreign investment pretty significantly. So that is one way that we think and would recommend Canada make policy changes to bring more money in. And lastly, competition policy. A bill was passed earlier this year, Bill C-59, which really shifted the competition policy landscape in Canada, moving away from a consumer welfare-oriented and effects-based approach to one that tries, again, in this theme of kind of looking at bigness and market structure, focusing on those things, when we know, in fact, that those measures aren't necessarily indicative of lack of competitiveness and lack of consumer welfare. So this was raised by the Business Council of Canada as concerning, and we hope that it may be rethought.
Thank you, Peter. You had said that Canada has a digital services tax. Presumably that tax could be used to increase infrastructure. That's how India did it. India had a specific tax on telecom, which is now gone, but had a specific tax on telecom, and that money was ring-fenced to then promote digital infrastructure to rural areas and promote rural broadband. So, I mean, how is Canada approaching, more widespread use of broadband?
Yeah, great question. I think it's fair to say that the government subsidization or taxation with the revenues redeployment for reinvesting, it can work. It works in the long run. We've seen it. We've talked about China here and other countries that take this approach. I think obviously the net economic benefit, social benefit is lower because it's not being put to the best uses when you take that approach. And so, as I alluded to at the outset, foreign investment in this space is restricted, and I think that's a way in that's really politically feasible. The companies in this space obviously have a lot of clout, but if something like that is properly circumscribed, it may not incur the ill will and open things up a little bit.
So it seems that Europe has sort of a preemptive inclination to regulate first, be very precautionary. If we go back to what Richard was talking about earlier, was more of a Silicon Valley posture, kind of leaning into and accepting risk. So there's a massive concentration of AI skills, technology companies in Silicon Valley. About half the global capital in AI is concentrated there right now. So there's been a debate in California, like everywhere else, about what do you do, how deeply do you regulate or not. So California has chosen actually to lean into it, like not ignore the regulatory questions, but the governor had an executive order last year they're implementing now, and it's in the report, basically instituting training for state employees to get them all to use AI as quickly as possible to improve government services. They have partnerships with NVIDIA to massively train workers, people not even with 4-year degrees, 2-year degrees, in AI skills, with the idea of developing the workforce, implementing it as quick as you can. And then the state legislature passed a bill a month ago that would actually sort of follow the European AI Act, and the governor vetoed it because his view, which a lot of the industry agreed with, was that it would erect enough barriers that would sort of inhibit investment and raise costs and inhibit access to AI. So the bottom line is, from a California standpoint, California isn't ignoring the regulatory issues of the risk, but it's more of an inclination in Silicon Valley to let's recognize the risk, but we're going to accept the risk. And when we think about the competitiveness of Europe, the thought in my mind is, will this make Europe more competitive? Will it extend more access to digital technology, more access to AI, if it follows the regulation first line, or are we looking with the California approach that's probably going to more massively expand access and deployment by striking a different balance between innovation and risk? So I'd welcome any thoughts from the panel on that, how you strike that balance.
Yes, please go ahead.
I have one actually, yeah, and thank you for alluding to what they're doing on the government side to ensure that people will be able to use it and have the competencies. I think we're hoping that Canada takes more of the California approach. I just see even the AI, it's not like it exists in the same form in all of its applications. So regulating it with one single act, it's just not the right approach. We're talking about some of these negative externalities that are already known, like the psychologically addictive, algorithms and this sort of thing. You can regulate that in its application, right? And in a particular sector. So that's what I'd say. And good to hear that California is doing what it's doing.
I have a comment and a quick question. To Peter, you mentioned about opening the market up for FDI and how that could bridge digital divide. The experience in India, we've opened it up for foreign investors, but the experience suggests that a lot of private sector really doesn't invest in the areas that require investment. They would still concentrate on urban markets where the return to investment is very, very high. Have you thought of this? And if yes, then what could be potential solutions? And to Gogo, couldn't agree more with what you said. The concern with the European approach is that a lot of countries like India, Brussels effect follows, right? We try to emulate a lot of regulation that your jurisdictions are following, and we struggle a lot more with regulatory capacity. And our research suggests that some of those concerns are actually mirrored in the EU also. So how do you think Europe is amping up its capacity, and what could we learn from it? Thank you.
Okay, I'll be brief. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a very good point. And so Canada does have a very strong tradition in all, provincial governments and federally of public-private partnerships. And that will be key here, undoubtedly. Another thing is, we do have a broadband access fund federally, and the provinces are investing in this. So it's not like there isn't funding going in, but I guess, you just wonder where that point at the curve is. And so obviously, we need more to incentivize companies to make these investments. So I think it does need that push. But there is already this infrastructure and tradition of public-private partnerships in the space to push it across the finish line.